So this is part of a six-part series that is grounding us tonight, especially foundations of racial capitalism. And again, given Mother Nature and weather, I'm really thankful for those of us who are here, thankful for those of you who are joining online. But I think I'm pivoting so that we can have a little bit of conversation tonight, and then we have a little bit of flexibility next Wednesday as well. So this is a series, and if Angela Wilcox, she is a member of the Beloved Community staff team, and a lot of tonight is in due and appreciation for her thinking about what are ways that we can organize conversations here at Unity Church. We have many people who have been engaged for a long, long time in our anti-racist work. And we are making a strong pivot in the direction that we're taking this. And so if Angela were here, she would say tonight is sort of an anchoring and grounding place. So we'll try to weave some of this for the folks who are not able to be here and to have some conversation more robustly than we may be able to have tonight. So that'll be our assignment, my assignment for next Wednesday coming up. Angela will also say that you do not necessarily need to attend the whole six-part series in sequence. We trust that tonight's grounding will be really helpful, as well as next Wednesday's grounding or continuation of the grounding. But you can come because the series takes a look at this thread of racial capitalism and sort of weaves it into the various focuses that we are giving, whether it's about land and ownership, whether it's about finance and debt and financialized capitalism that we are in right now, whether it's about immigrations and customs enforcement and border patrol and the policing and the militarization of nation states and regimes and boundaries, borders. So this theme will play out in many different ways as we continue to expand and deepen our anti-racist work. I put this up here to remind us about the ends. And this is an ambitious and challenging and radical and wonderful, powerful end, to understand the interconnected roots of oppression and yoke ourselves to the demands, sacrifices, and hard work of anti-racism, multiculturalism, and climate and economic justice. I want to play, I think we're all gathered so we can begin. I want to play a video from a wise and much beloved teacher, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who has been doing this work for a long, long time. And so maybe Heidi will cue up the video and we'll use that as our chalice lighting. Let me build on what Ruth was just saying. There is this inextricable connection between racism and political economy that today we call capitalism. Political economy, as some of you have asked, meaning that the economic and the political domains, and I would also include the social domain, they are interwoven. That the economy is shaped by our form of governance, which is shaped by gender, race, orientations of one kind or another. So there is this inextricable connection between capitalism and the political economy. And the Black radical tradition has been giving voice to this, I want to say forever, because it feels that way. So here's some examples. This goes back to 1865. Frederick Douglass is giving a speech, and I pull out this quote. The slave is robbed by his master of all his earnings above what is required for his physical necessities, and the white man is robbed by the slave system because he is flung into competition with a class of laborers who work without wages. He's echoing Karl Marx, who a year earlier in 1864 sent a letter to Abraham Lincoln to congratulate Lincoln on his becoming reinstated as the incumbent president. And in the letter, this is what Karl Marx writes. In the United States of America, every independent workers' movement was paralyzed as long as slavery disfigured part of the republic. Labor cannot emancipate itself in the white skin, where in the black it is branded. So here's Frederick Douglass, Karl Marx, contemporaries, riffing, elaborating, commenting on what they're perceiving about empire, about racism, about capitalism. Speed forward into the 1930s, W.E.B. Du Bois. For those of you who know his writings on Black Reconstruction, you know that he's increasingly learning from Marxism. His methodology, his analysis, his political commitments, while he may not have formally become Marxist earlier on, but he's learning a lot. To the point where he describes famously the Civil War as a labor revolution. But I'm pulling this from Black Reconstruction in America, 1935 book. The theory of race was supplemented by a carefully planned and slowly evolved method which drove such a wedge between the white and black workers that there probably are not today in the world two groups of workers with practically identical interests, but who hate and fear each other so deeply. He's getting at a racialization that drives a wedge between two groups, two identities, who, from a Marxist point of view, his point of view, are practically aligned in their interests, and yet they are at war with one another. Some of you know Stuart Hall, coming out of the Caribbean, British, but he's writing in his 1980 essay, and out of it, this famous phrase, race is the modality in which class is lived. Race is the modality in which class is lived. But racial capitalism, that phrase, that concept, racial capitalism, is finally formulated in a 1983 book by Cedric Robinson called Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. Cedric Robinson is also informed deeply, prophetically, by Marxist thought, and he's critical of Marxism because he's realizing that there are gaps in the way that Marx powerfully, analytically understood capitalism. And so this framing it as Black Marxism, the coming together of race and capitalism. He's not the first, as I've already alluded to, with other prominent thinkers beginning to formulate what Cedric Robinson calls racial capitalism. I'm thinking of other radical thinkers like C.L.R. James, Eric Williams and his book Capitalism and Slavery, Oliver Cromwell Cox, Caste, Class, and Race, 1948. Feminist thinkers, Claudia Jones, goes on to become not only a diplomat, but president in Ghana, Kwame Nkrumah. But these are international thinkers, as well as national thinkers, who are beginning to make that connection that becomes, in Cedric Robinson's concept, racial capitalism. Racial capitalism is different than what some other scholars might call racialized capitalism. Racial capitalism, as we heard Ruth say, is all of capitalism, is capitalism from the get-go. Is when feudalism begins to sort of morph into the beginnings of capitalism, you have already had a way in which power, the elites, have organized and positioned the other, whether the other is the Irish, the Jew, the Roma, the slaves, within the continent today that we call Europe, is this organization, this racialization that is at work. So it is not the need to go to Africa or Latin America or Asia. Within Europe, we have this organization of racialized hierarchy. And so as feudalism, premised on land, we're going to get to land in this series, right, transfers into private ownership, and then this notion of capital, which generally defined as anything that can be used to derive value, right? Social capital, political capital, economic capital. But as feudalism gives way and morphs into the beginnings of capitalism, that organization of identities, of people, is being weaponized for the purposes of emerging capitalism. It is not, there is some race-neutral capitalism that then becomes racialized. Some people use the word racialized capitalism, which gets at that. But the Black radical tradition is saying, no, that's not how we understand the history of this. It is racial from the beginning. It is not an accident. It is a feature of what we understand capitalism to be. As Ruth said, racism requires inequality. Race, gender, all of these ways we organize people and groups is available for the purpose of inequality. What race does is to offer capitalism a way to rationalize inequality, to enshrine it, using Ruth's word, to divide workers and peoples and identities, to justify state violence in the exploitation and the subjugation of people, to create, to use Marx's phrase, surplus people, not only surplus value, right? After all of the costs and balancing it out, oh, we profited. Not just that surplus value, but surplus populations in the sense of expendable populations, disposable populations of people, especially with technology. As we industrialize, as we digitize, and as we create AI and robots, there are certain people we don't need anymore. They're replaceable. What do we mean by surplus populations during pandemic and COVID? We've heard essential workers. So surplus populations, in some sense, are essential. During the rest of our normal capitalism, we don't even bother to see them, to pay them living wages. I'll get to living wages because in capitalism, there is no such thing as a living wage. But essential workers are in some sense essential because they take care of the most basic essential needs for the functioning of the political economy called capitalism. But if we come up with a better option, then they're not essential. They become expendable. They're exterminated. They're disposed of. So what we're beginning to see is that capitalism is racial from the get-go. There are some scholars who would say it's better maybe to state it as race and class, but the Black radical tradition, again, would dispute that. No, it is not race and class, and somehow they interact and meet one another. Of course they do in the way that we try to grapple with them. But historically, it is not race somehow separately, and class somehow separately, and then they happen to converge and encounter one another. Cedric Robinson and the Black radical tradition is about, no, from the very beginnings, it is racial capitalism, because capitalism requires inequality, requires disposability, requires a rationale for justifying injustice and exploitation. That is where we're beginning. For those of us who have been in the DNA of anti-racism at Unity Church, I want to say something briefly. The DEI work exists at the level of within and among, and it's been really important work to take a look at our unconscious bias, to look at the microaggressions in which our anxiety, our privilege plays out, and to become increasingly aware of those things. But the within and the among, as necessary and as important as they are, if we simply pause there and we do not get at the beyond, then we have really made our anti-racist work toothless. The beyond is the water that we are swimming in. The beyond is, in some sense, the powerful reason why generation after generation after generation, this seems to just go on and on and on. Why is that? Because the structures and the systems that we have created, the waters that we swim in, pivot us to these socialized practices and policies and the way that we structure our relations with one another. At the heart of which is this thing called racial capitalism. So, rooted in the within among work, we are making a big, complex, intersectional, conjunctural move into this beyond. And if you get a headache thinking about it, thank you for willing to go there. To look at all of the ways that our within and among has been shaped by the atmosphere, the water that we swim in. Tema Okun, many of you are familiar with characteristics like perfectionism. Why is it that dominant culture socializes us into a kind of perfectionism? That itself could be a Wellspring Wednesday conversation. But think about racial capitalism. Think about things that we put into Scripture that are actually not even in Scripture. You know, that God helps those who help themselves? How do we sneak meritocracy, earning your salvation, into the biblical witness to radical, magnanimous grace, generosity? It's there in the water that we're swimming in. And so we find our Bibles, our scriptures, read through these dominant frames, namely racial capitalism. Or Tema Okun would talk about the written word and our fascination with the written word, because if it's not written, it's not true. If the accountant's ledger book does not record it, then how are we to account for reality? You begin to see the within and the among play of these anti-racist practices have been there because of the structures, the overarching structures, so that even our anti-racist work at the level of among becomes toothless without looking at the beyond. This is the direction that we are taking this work. This is my heavy pivot for tonight. More people are coming in, that's great. More people are online. But I want to speak a little bit about capitalism. The racial capitalism will begin to make sense as you pull the pieces together. But I want all of us to put on our thinking hats, those of you who remember your Econ 101 or the undergraduate course on capitalism. I will try to do a useful gloss. We won't go into too much technical language or jargon, although I will to some degree, because they're really revelatory. If there was an analytical, even prophetic thinker on capitalism, hands down, Karl Marx, Engels. These are the people who are beginning to look at what is going on in the world and arguably offered us one of the most powerful lenses and frames to understand how this reality operates within, among, beyond, at the international level, right? Ruth is in Portugal looking at the fascist government and what it's doing in its colonialism and how capitalism is the thing that is driving that. And because it's at that water level, it remains hidden, invisible. The wind only becomes visible in the effects. And so when I think about capitalism, what is it that I want to just put out there for tonight and then to be picked up more in detail in the coming series? I want to remind us about some of the narrow common sense view of capitalism. You'll recognize these words. Means of production. Think about a factory. Who owns that factory? The capitalists. The owners, we get this building of private ownership, and because they have the machines, they have the resources, and then ultimately they have the labor, private ownership of the means of production. What is it that the workers own? They own what Karl Marx calls labor power. They bring a capacity, they bring a potential, they come to the work site, and then they offer their labor. By offering their labor, they actually create value. If you want another analogy, think about a seed. A seed is inexpensive, but think about all that then builds from that seed, ultimately leading to the harvest. Or think about a violin and the cost of making a violin, but from that potential comes music, performances. You can even do an economics about all the concerts. But that's what Karl Marx is getting at in terms of the essential rudiments of what we mean by capitalism. It is delimited to the sphere called economics. And he's saying there are really two, I'll get to the third one, really core parts of capitalism. You have the ownership of the means of production, and then you have the ownership that the worker brings, which is just their labor power, their capacity, right? And then you have to have maybe this third important thing, a market, a site of exchange where this happens. And so building on those three in Capital, Das Kapital, as he builds on that in volumes 2, 3, he's talking about the circulation, the marketplace, but he ultimately gets to the fact that then you get to this thing called like debt, about financing, about interest, about rent. If you don't have enough, then maybe you could get a loan, you can rent out things. So it becomes increasingly layered and complex as Marx is beginning to look at the analytical, constitutive parts of capitalism. I've already started to talk about the traditional Marxist understanding. Marx, as he's analyzing capitalism, recognizes there's something going on there that is about exploitation. So at the heart of Marxist analysis of capitalism is this market in which there is this exchange taking place, but the exchange is actually not an exchange of equivalency. There's actually an inequality built into that marketplace of exchange, without which you can't have what he called surplus value, right? If you're paying the workers a certain wage and it perfectly balances out with whatever their labor has produced in the final value, then there's no surplus to that system. That leads us into a different kind of political economy we'll get to, called socialism or communism, right? But in capitalism, there has to be a surplus. You want to end up with more and more the imperative of building capital, right? And so Marx is looking at this system of capitalism and saying, there is an inequality built into the production of surplus value. And he's wondering, let's spell that out. What is that inequality? And this is what he comes up with. He says, when the person arrives at the factory, capitalism just needs that they arrive at the factory. That probably means they need to have some food, clothing, shelter, a little bit of training to know what it is that they need to do, right? These basic things, including rest, right? But it begins sort of at this demarcation called factory. And capitalism needs to pay a wage. This is when the language becomes very technical. A wage is to make sure that this person shows up at the factory on Monday morning, ready to do the work that they do. And so the wage needs to compensate for whatever is required for them to show up on Monday morning. And it's these very basic subsistence level items. You want to keep the cost really low. Why? Surplus value. I want to end up with a profit at the end of the day. So you compensate the potential for work, labor, power. That's called a wage. The wage is paying for, another technical word in capitalism and Marxist thought, a commodity. The potential that the worker brings for labor power, is a thing that can be commodified, is a thing that you can put a little packaging around it within capitalism and say, that's a thing, and I'll put a price on it. And I want to keep that price minimum, but commodification means that something has entered into this capitalistic system. And so I'm going to put a wage on it. Remember my comment earlier that in capitalism, there is no such thing as a living wage. Depends on, I guess, maybe what you mean by living. Because in capitalism, you want to make that wage subsistence level, if even that, right? So there is a relationship that exploits the worker, because Marx is saying, you know, when I look at the cost in reproducing this worker who comes in to invest their labor, right? All of the cost that's needed to reproduce that thing, Marx says, it's pretty bare minimum. And that's where exploitation happens. So that word exploitation is very precise again within Marx's understanding, interpretation of capitalism. There's another word that's different than exploitation, and the word is expropriation. Expropriation means dispossession. It can mean theft. You just take it. Marx doesn't go far enough in his understanding of the cost to reproduce that person showing up on Monday morning, is the critique from the Black radical tradition, is a critique from Cedric Robinson, is a critique from all of the people who have been colonized and have been subjugated to racial capitalism. So let's imagine that Rosa is given a wage so that she can show up at the factory on Monday morning. And what are those basic things? Well, they're really bare minimum things. But let's flesh this out beyond putting a number to that cost, beyond just thinking about Rosa through the economy. Let's say that in the actual lived experience of Rosa, her mother, Gloria, is at home, doing the shopping, taking care of the kids, changing the diaper, doing domestic labor, doing gendered labor, doing racialized labor, people of color who are nannies, taking care of children, right? Doing emotional labor. Oh, Marx didn't really take that into account all that much. When someone shows up on Monday morning, if they've been traumatized, if they have something emotionally really difficult, it could actually incapacitate them. It could actually go from the psychological to the physical, right? We begin to see that in actuality, in real life, these spheres are helpful in kind of naming the distinctions, but are they ever completely separate from each other? No. If you've had a crappy Sunday evening argument at home, or your baby has kept you up all night and you're just really upset and tired, it's not going to be easy showing up to the factory on Monday morning. Gloria is taking care of all of that. Rosa and Gloria have worked it out so that Rosa, who really depends on the factory work, can show up on Monday morning. Gloria doesn't have a wage. Remember, that's a technical word. A wage is a wage because it is now visible within the capitalistic system. Gloria works, expends a lot of energy and care, but is not compensated for with a wage. The wage goes to Rosa, but only for her ability, capacity to show up at the factory on Monday morning. Do you begin to see how the Black radical thinkers, do you begin to see how the liberation theologians in the 50s, 60s, 70s are beginning to realize, wait a minute, there's a lot that the economists of capitalism are ignoring, or they're putting a number on it, but the basis for whatever number that they come up with is entirely fictional, is entirely itself based on competing with other multinational corporations, other CEOs, and what is dropped away are the glorias of the world. What has been expropriated is Gloria. Gloria has been simply stolen by capitalism. Gloria is an assumption that is made without ever accounting for the labor of love and care and domestic and gender and emotion and spiritual, whatever. Not only domestic, but what about the streets? What about the people who keep it clean? What about medicine? What about education? Teachers are generalists. They don't just teach books. Those of you who are teachers among us, you are lovers of our children. You attend to the whole of their being. Does capitalism account for that? No. that level of care and responsibility and obligation is simply assumed. And so Marx himself does not go far enough. He stops pretty much with exploitation of Rosa in that exchange that is not about equivalency. That's exploitation. Karl Marx does not go far and deep enough to consider all of the other spheres of actual lived life that allows for Rosa to show up on Monday morning. I hope this is ringing a bell for some of you, remembering back. This is the last place I want to go. What happens if we let this capitalism continue its merry way, ignoring, expropriating gender, expropriating race? I'm going to get to that. What happens? This capitalism becomes cannibalistic. Nancy Fraser and other economists have been using cannibal capitalism because it eats up, it devours the very things that it needs for it to be viable, right? If it does not take care of Gloria, it's just a matter of time before Rosa no longer can show up and the factory can no longer show up, and then there's no more surplus. Of course, capitalism has a response to that scenario, right? It just goes on to others who are made dependent on that factory, on capitalism, until all those others are also eaten up. And so you see the cannibalization that's going on. Not only that, there's a kind of cannibalization that Karl Marx called primitive accumulation. I don't like that phrase, but he's meaning natural resources, the ecology. We will use up, we will devour ecological resources at a rate that cannot be regenerated. So capitalism at a certain point will devour nature that makes its own possibility real. Not only that, go to the sphere called politics and governance. Capitalism, in its lust for surplus value, will say, let's deregulate. We don't like some of these laws. That just impedes and slows down capital accumulation. So deregulation, privatization of things. Oh, let's do Citizens United. Corporations. Capital has the same political rights so that in the end, the market, the economics, triumphs over every other sphere and thus cannibalizes what makes it even viable in the first place. It cannibalizes social support. I think the social services, it just costs too much, says our current administration. Let's have a big bill that gets rid of funding for all of these social services. And then let's see what happens to the Rosas of the world. And if they die off, we'll go on to others. And if they die off, well, why should we care about that? We might not even be around, right? So cannibal capitalism is the logic of capitalism that Karl Marx was analytically, prophetically describing. It will run its course if left to that violent logic, and it will cannibalize everything. I want to pause and maybe if I can ask, I forgot to bring copies of the plague. Heidi, would you be able to run to my office? Actually, can you show screen that up here? Oh, that's even better. I wanted to invite you to think about another empire that I know I'm using words and putting it back into history, but think about Egypt, Pharaoh, Moses, the Exodus story as an empire with its own version of racial capitalism. I'll distribute the paper handouts maybe next Wednesday. This is a racialized economy. This is an economy based on the Israelites, the Hebrew people who have found their way at first in the elite culture. Joseph, if you remember, rises in the ranks according to the story and becomes one of the elites. But in the course of time, the people multiply and the Hebrews are racialized. And they become too many. And so the empire enslaves the Israelites and enlists their labor. They are not only exploited, they are really expropriated, right? Think about this system that devours the people. The Hebrew slaves whose entire life, from birth until death, if you will, think about the auction blocks, right? Property owned by empire, by a capitalist system. And you know the story well. There are these 10 plagues that lead to the liberation, the emancipation of the Israelite slaves. And rather than thinking about these 10 plagues as like supernatural, random events that somehow led to the emancipation of the Israelite slaves, the Hebrew professors that I studied with, who were themselves students of Marxism, I put this together as a way of looking at what is going on in this story. This, in some sense, might be the Black radical tradition. The first of the 10 plagues is water that is turned into blood. What is the sector of the economy that is disrupted? Transportation, irrigation, fishing. What is its economic meaning? It collapses the supply chain along the Nile. It halts commerce and food production. It exposes the fragility of empire's lifeline. The infrastructure that keeps the empire of Egypt as an empire is disrupted with that first plague. And then think about the frogs. The verses in Exodus talk about how the frogs go everywhere. They go into the food preparations, and there's a certain purity code, and so it stops domestic labor only for the Egyptians, not for the Israelites, right? So what does this plague of frogs going everywhere? It overwhelms the household labor of the Egyptians, disrupts reproductive, not just sexual reproduction, I'm using it in the Marxist sense. It disrupts all of the things that are necessary for you to show up on Monday morning. So the frogs begin to have that disruption. The gnats, dust is turned into gnats, and the agriculture and the livestock, right, are impacted by that. What's the economic meaning? The field labor and animal husbandry is paused. Are you beginning to recognize what these 10 plagues are doing to the economic system of the Egyptian empire under Pharaoh? All the way go to the boils. We go from infrastructure to the production of goods to boils that affect the Egyptian human labor force. It incapacitates them. Even the administrative class, the overseers of Egypt. So the boils is Yahweh, God's radical disruption of human labor. Empire cannot function as human labor is incapacitated. Hail, locust, the remaining crops, everything green is collapsed. It questions food security. there's a complete destruction of agricultural surplus. Remember, surplus value, capital, production, accumulation. This is what the plagues, in a series of intentional sabotage, is beginning to do to this empire under Pharaoh, all the way to darkness. Fredheim interprets darkness as no more surveillance, no more dark SUVs. It is governance that is stunted. It is the paralysis of the administrative and the coercive apparatus of the state. It is the interruption to the policing and the militarization thereof. And then it culminates in the death of the firstborn, which is when Pharaoh, empire, finally says, okay, enough, enough. What is the death of the firstborn? It interrupts inheritance, economic continuity, the succession of power. What does it do to economics? It breaks generational transfer of wealth, privilege, power. Theologically, what is going on with the plague, right, is Yahweh's divine intervention in a political economy, in a racialized capitalism. I shouldn't say that, racial capitalism from the get-go, right? Because inequality is a feature, it is an inherent structure of capitalism. It is Yahweh that is sabotaging this economic ordering of life, one plague after another plague after another plague. I want to pause here. And while I run to my office and get another handout I forgot as well, turn to your neighbor and share what is an intervention that comes to mind for you. Like these 10 plagues, what is an intervention that disrupts racial capitalism? So to contemporize this biblical story, what is something that you can identify as an example that disrupts? If you're all thinking unions and strikes, great. That's readily available. But be creative. What is something that you have experienced that disrupts this system called racial capitalism? Let me call us back. And I'm going to ask you to speak up. I am curious about what are some contemporary examples of a disruption, an interruption to racial capitalist system that you have thought? Boycotts, thank you. Non-cooperation, right? Withdrawal. This is Ash Wednesday. Ash Wednesday, in some sense, is an invitation to boycott, to fast. These are spiritual technologies and disciplines, right? To not to participate anymore in this system that exploits, expropriates, exterminates people. Others. Go ahead. Yeah, yeah, yeah. This idea of universalizing, there is an interesting debate, right, among socialists um, about universal basic income, because by itself, most socialists would disagree with that. They would vote against that, because by itself, you are leaving people with an income, a wage of some kind, but they continue to participate in this kind of extractive economy. So the other argument, rather than a universal basic income, is what are things that need to become public goods, just available, that are not open to this kind of exchange and commodification, that are just givens in a society? Yeah. But the idea that it must be universal, it concerns all of us, because the spheres of life are not separable, right? What we don't do here actually will circulate and come around. Yeah.
Oh.
Hello. I was thinking of tool libraries where people are sharing their resources, or just neighbors helping neighbors, kind of like what John McKnight did, asset-based community development.
Yeah.
Is that disrupting?
Yeah.
Seems like it is.
Yeah, absolutely. It's counter hoarding, it's counter privatization. It is a socializing, maybe even a communitarianizing of tools, whatever resources. We're actually going to come back to that. So thank you for that.
Actually, even when you think about some youth movements, of course, the 60s, and then going off in a commune, being separate from the dominant culture,
Mhm.
and then the whole idea, growing your own food, all those different things, and for different reasons, young people were drawn to that. And then, of course, it gets very complicated when drugs and all these other things get into the mix. But even that, there's ways, that governments are like, okay, that's okay if it's here, but then if it gets bigger, and then, they're not being productive. But I was also thinking of why what you're talking about is so topical, because with what we're facing with AI, and if people like, I call them the muskrat, are saying things like, in years we're gonna, not everybody's gonna have to work, and then talking about these systems where people get paid just so that, we don't have millions of homeless. But that's gonna be a whole nother, like, really disruptive structure, like who then, because there are people already who don't have to work because of not only their income but their wealth. So there's different things like that.
There's several things that you said, and we'll take one more, but I want to highlight the sort of underground economy or alternative economy so that alongside boycott, you don't have to participate in the dominant forms of extraction, exploitation, but there is an alternative economy that has existed throughout human history as well, right? How people care for one another in this alternative mode that imagines a different social order. We're going to touch on that as well. How about one more contemporary example of a plague?
We we have one over here. She already gave me the microphone, so I guess I'll go. Okay. Good. Is it working now? Oh, so we talked about cooperatives, which is maybe a similar idea.
Yeah. Cooperatives along the lines of what people have said. How do we reimagine coming together to share, not hoard? Um, and what is the value that can come out of cooperatives? So much of capitalism also begs this idea of hyper individualism. Ezra Klein was one of the few people who put out there that maybe we are reaching late stage individualism because it's becoming now apparent how individualism also leads to a kind of cannibalization, that we can no longer continue at the hyper individualistic level. Yeah. I think these are all wonderful contemporary readings of plagues, of ways in which our theology, our spirituality, our ethics disrupts dominant extraction, exploitation, expropriation, extermination, lots of excess. Um, I want to take the remaining time. I promise we'll come back to this and build on it, but um, I want to read through this text. I've chosen familiar stories, familiar in my understanding of this demographic. This is another familiar story that continues, it's a segue from the Exodus narrative. Let me just read this aloud and ask you to follow along. This is from the 6th chapter of the Gospel according to Mark. This is the famous, the familiar, feeding the 5,000. As I read through this, I want you to think about the kind of concepts and terms that we have been using. This is a narrative about another racialized community. In first century Palestine, the racialization looks a little bit like this, but not to forget what Ruth was talking about, right? In Europe, you have the beginnings of racial capitalism, right? We will always come up with ways of grouping and indexing and hierarchicalizing, right? Groups and identities. And in first century Palestine, you have way up at the hierarchy Judeans, followed probably by the rural Galileans, followed by the bastards or the hybrids, Samaritans, because they were crossbreeds. Today we would call them multicultural units, right? And then the Gentiles, the foreigners, the aliens, right? So even in first century Palestine, even in this story that we're about to read, is a racialized setting in which an economy is at work. The apostles gathered around Jesus and told him all that they had done and taught. He said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." For many were coming and going, and they had no leisure even to eat. And they went away in a boat to a deserted place by themselves. Now, many saw them going and recognized them, and they hurried there on foot from all the towns and arrived ahead of them. As he, Jesus, went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it grew late, his disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now very late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding country and villages and buy something for themselves to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." They said to him, "Are we to go and buy 200 denarii worth of bread and give it to them to eat?" And he said to them, "How many loaves have you? Go and see." When they had found out, they said, 5, and 2 fish. Then he ordered them to get all the people to sit down in groups on the green grass. When scripture becomes very detailed, that should like perk your antennas, like, what's going on here? This is coded language for first century religion, right? So they sat down in groups of hundreds and of 50s. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. And he divided the 2 fish among them all. And all ate and were filled. And they took up 12 baskets full of broken pieces and of the fish. Those who had eaten the loaves numbered 5,000 men. Patriarchy still at work in terms of who gets counted, who doesn't. Women, children were undoubtedly part of that story. In the story, we are given something that I think, as I said, is a segue perhaps from Exodus, because as the Israelite slaves leave this political economy, let's call it racial capitalism, they take with them certain things that they think belong to them. If you're thinking reparations, you would not be wrong, right? They're taking things that rightfully, ethically belong to them. And then they go out into this commons called the wilderness, where they are being invited into a new communitarian way of economizing their life together. Economy from oikumena, economics, is about household affairs, right? Here we have another wilderness, a deserted place. And if you are the author of this story in Mark, there's no way that you are not thinking about the Israelites going into the wilderness. These 2 stories are about political economies. It's late out in this no place. The people have gathered, and now they need to eat. What does it mean when the disciples say, "It's late, we should send them away so that they could buy something so that they can eat"? We're going to do a midrash. I'll pretend to be a rabbi. We're going to interpret this text according to political economy. What does it mean when the disciples say, "We should let the people go away so that they could go and buy whatever they need to eat"? Send the workers home? What else? Not my problem. Yeah. Yeah. Do they have the means to buy it? All of those questions are there, right? The rabbis interpret this because they're also looking at political economy about the ways that we are all socialized into the dominant market system. It is our mode of consciousness. In this economy, what do you do when you're hungry? You go and you participate in the political economy. You go into the marketplace. And with your money, whatever wages you may have, you purchase. And probably at the practice of individual consumption, right? We tend to interpret this story miraculously, meaning supernaturally, but the miracle is not some supernatural, right, ascientific stuff. The writer is keeping in mind Exodus. The miracle is not something against science and supernatural thing. The miracle is a reimagination, a reorganizing of political economy. I'm getting ahead of myself. No, Jesus says, you give them something to eat. What's going on there? Rather, someone mentioned boycott, underground economy. Hey, stop. Don't participate in this dominant, extractive, exploitive economy. Let's see what we can do among ourselves, right? It reorganizes the consciousness and the imaginary of a people who have been dependent on wage, let's say, and been blinded by the dominant way of seeing to even internalize that oppression. So that Rosa goes home, we go home, and we discredit the work. We do not recognize, we do not put value on what her mother Gloria has been doing all along. We ourselves have internalized this dominant oppressive system so that we say, oh, I can't work. I have no skills. There's nothing on my resume. There's nothing that would be marketable. And here's this prophetic rabbi saying, no, you, we, together, we will respond to this situation. They go, and what do they find? Yeah, 5 sandwiches, 2 sardines, let's say, right? Do you think it's realistic that the people who are racialized, otherized people would go into the wilderness naively without knowing temperature, time, their direction? In all reality, what do you think they would have taken with them for such a journey? But is it made visible to the disciples? No. Whatever resources, they don't really count as resources. And the social imaginary of this gathered community is stunted by Egypt still. They cannot imagine a different way of economizing the resources, because the resources, they don't even consider resources. Just like Karl Marx did not go beyond exploitation. He could not look at, there were, so many other variables that are behind showing up to the factory on Monday morning. It is the theology or the mindset or the politics of scarcity at work in Egypt and in this community at the outset. It is the theology or the ideology of capitalistic competition that is at work that stunts the imaginary of the people from reimagining a different way of being together. Remember, it took the Israelites proverbially 40 years wandering to reclaim that prophetic imaginary of abundance, of sharing, of non-hoarding. Remember the manna that falls every morning? It's about non-hoarding. Egypt taught everyone, it's absolutely about storing it up and hoarding until the flies get at it. It is that there is an abundance, but we don't recognize it because the systems that have educated us, socialized us, frightened us, terrorized us, and fear is a real powerful socialization factor. It has blinded us. And so the prophets always say, you have eyes, why don't you see? You have ears, why can't you hear? There is an inherent abundance of resources gathered there. What is that detail about having the people sit in hundreds and fifties? Those of us who have done organizing work. It's about intentional community. It's about scaling your way into seeing one another and cooperating with one another. Because it is always the empire's strategy to fragment, divide, so that competition is what's operating.
Because these followers are not going out and buying the bread, and then someone's getting that money. And when in some of the teachings, it's about follow me. And then if this is happening again and again in different communities, and these people are not going back to the workforce, that's, it's a continuing disruption. So by the time you get to Pilate, the people are saying, well, these followers and these sects of people are not participating and doing the things we want them to do.
There is a radical transformation of consciousness that is going on. Everyone is fed. Someone used the word universal. Everyone is fed. Universal provision. There is no one who goes without. They are all satisfied. They have enough. This is not a story about gluttony, greed, excess. There is surplus, isn't there? What happens to this surplus? To whom does this surplus belong? To the elites? To the pharaohs? The surplus belongs to the community. If you're thinking socialism, you're right on. Labor always creates greater value. But that value that is created by labor, by creativity, by entrepreneurship, by innovation, does not get extracted, exploited, expropriated to the elite class. It belongs to the community. For the community, through political governance, through social values operating, to decide how they, as a beloved community, are going to utilize surplus. And according to Scripture, I want to say all scriptures, what is the function of surplus? For the bad times, for the care of everybody, the universal value, the surplus that is actively looking for the widow, the orphan, the alien, the stranger, the poor, those who are without, so that there is no person in this beloved community who is without. It is the absolute opposite of the racialization, the othering in Pharaoh's economy. It is as an other, you hold on to your unique identity, and there is equitable distribution of needs. That's what surplus is for, right? Or liturgically at church on Thanksgiving, I think about that because that's one of the visible sites of abundance when we celebrate it. You bring that surplus to God, not as some sort of, I have to merit salvation, because God becomes the name, the site, the placeholder of gratitude, of generosity. And what do the priests in Israel do with altar food offerings? Exactly what I've said. They go and they distribute it. So we have here an economics of the redistribution of resources that is anti-hoarding, that is anti-competition, and it is an abundance that offers surplus in a way that capitalism could never imagine the production of surplus. It is a spiritual, theological, religious, human surplus. Yes, you have something. Oh, my.
Example, is there an example of where surplus has been used this way effectively?
That's a great question. Contemporary example of the way that surplus has been used. Thank you. Mutual aid. In this moment, the way that people are bringing the needs of communities, and in that gathering, we discover, oh my gosh, we have resources, surplus of them than we had thought. Yeah, 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 yeah. Most clergy think about other stories. If you haven't seen Babette's Feast, surplus in a place that seems so competitive and afraid and cold and bitter and scarce, comes this radical feast, a surplus abundance. I know we are at time. I hope this conversation seeded some ideas about racial capitalism, how capitalism, just even looking at capitalism, is necessarily, as a feature of its continued expansion, continued exploitation, expropriation, uses dynamics like race, like gender, like all the countless forms of othering, so that it can naturalize inequality, so that it can justify exploitation, it can rationalize state violence. Because what capitalism is trying to do is make whatever the wage is, the cost of reproducing labor, as minimum, as subsistence as possible, to the point of invisibilizing all of the racialized others at home, in the byways, on the borders from Mexico to the United States. We'll get to policing, because there's got to be some mechanism that the pharaohs have to squash this revolutionary insight and people coming in, because the system doesn't want people coming in, so that we then have to be contending with what we do with our limited, scarce resources and the growing numbers of people. It must maintain scarcity and policing to protect that for the few. The plagues, this Markan story, is an invitation to imagine otherwise, not towards some fantastical thing. It actually is to imagine our way to the reality of the truth of what is already now available. Scarcity is the fiction and the fantasy. Abundance is the reality. May I conclude us in prayer? Holy One, we gather on this snowy evening, grateful for the people who were able to engage and participate, to think carefully and critically and prophetically and imaginatively to the abundance that resides, if we might see it. Thank you for this series, the continuation of this conversation, so that the scales might fall from our eyes and from our minds, that we might be converted into what is true and real and good at a historical moment when the cannibalistic tendencies and dynamics are all too real and evident, for the sake of each of us and for the beloved community that is our covenant and our practice. May it be so. Amen. Safe travels. To be continued. Thank you for this conversation this evening.
Oh.